Good morning. Today we will be having a class on major connectors. Major connector is a component of a of a removable partial denture which connects the components on one side of the arch to that on the other side of the arch. All the parts of the partial denture are attached either directly or indirectly to the major connector of that particular arch. Okay, a major connector must be rigid. That is an absolute condition. The connector should always be rigid, and it should provide a vertical support and it should protect the underneath the soft tissues that lies underneath. It should provide a means of obtaining indirect retention wherever it is indicated. That is, there should be a provision to provide indirect retentive elements onto the major connector, and it should be able to provide an opportunity for positioning the denture bases when needed, and it should always the priority that the major connector does not cause any discomfort to the patient. The maxillary arch in the maxillary removable partial denture, the major connector should be at least 6 mm away from the gingival clavicle area of the tooth, and in the mandible it should be at least 3 mm away from the gingival margin, and the border should run parallel to the gingival margin of the teeth. If the margin must be crossed, the crossing must be done at right angles and to maintain to produce the least possible contact with the soft tissues at the junction where of the tooth and the soft tissue. Okay, coming to the types of the maxillary major connectors, there is a single posterior palatal bar, there is a palatal strap, there is antero-posterior or double palatal bar, there is a horseshoe shaped connector or U-shaped connector, there is also a closed horseshoe or an antero-posterior palatal strap, and the final variety of complete maxillary major connectors is a complete palatal is a one with a complete palatal coverage. Now coming to the individual major connectors, the first one we'll discuss here is the single palatal posterior palatal bar. A single posterior palatal bar is a design in which there is a narrow half oval shape connector that is curved gently, and it does not form a sharp angle at any juncture with the denture base. It is like a bar in the posterior part, and the minimal area of the palate is covered in this kind of a major connector. The most major advantage of this kind of connector is that it does not cause any irritation to the patient, as there is only a very minor contact with the soft tissue, and it is indicated when single posterior bar is only indicated normally in cases of a interim partial denture. The most major disadvantage of it is one of the most difficult maxillary major connector for the patient to adjust to. That is because the patient might the single palatal bar has by nature is very thin, and it should be rigid. So the thing is, when we have to make a thin bar rigid, it will be kind of thicker, so it might cause an irritation to the patient. So it is not that much recommended, and even though the palatal coverage is very less, the thickness and the bulk of the connector might cause a problem to the patient. It should and it is also suggested that it should never be used in a distal extension edentulous situation, or it should not be used when anterior teeth is to be replaced. Now coming to the palatal strap, it is the most versatile maxillary major connector. The palatal strap is located in 3 planes: the horizontal or vault of the palate, and the vertical or the lateral stops of the palate, the sagittal and the antero-posterior slope of the palate. It offers a great resistance to bending or twisting forces, and thus it gives a much better rigidity when compared with very little bulk of the material. That is because even though it does not cover the full amount of the palate, it covers all the slopes, that is the lateral slopes, the antero-posterior slopes, and it is wider, so with a minimal amount of material it can be rigid. So the palatal strap is the mostly used connector in case of a cast partial denture. The due to this function, the main advantage is that it can be kept thin, thus increasing the patient comfort. It offers little interference to the tongue as when compared to the previous type of major connector that we have discussed, that is the single that is the previous one, that is the single posterior palatal bar, which I mentioned will be thicker. So it will cause an irritation to the patient when the patient when the tongue falls on it. Okay, the major disadvantage is that the patient may complain of excessive palatal coverage. See, everything other than everything foreign in the mouth will feel awkward to the patient, and it might cause a little bit of irritation to the patient, because there is supposed to be palatal coverage, and more the palatal coverage, there will be discomfort to the patient. The posterior border of this kind of a major connector should terminate short of the junction of the hard and the soft palate, and must avoid crossing the torus or a prominent median structure. Another possible disadvantage is that adverse soft tissue reaction from in the form of papillary hyperplasia may occur due to the larger and wider palatal coverage. Now coming to the next one, that is the anteroposterior or double palatal bar. This kind of a bar, due to its by design, is very rigid and sturdy, and thus the connector should be this connector should not be used unless the remaining tooth have good periodontal support, and the major advantage is that its rigidity in comparison to the amount of soft tissue coverage. It is by far the most rigid maxillary major connector, and this bar may be used when support is not major consideration and the anterior and posterior abutments are widely separated. In patients with large palatal torus, which may occur in between the two components of the anteroposterior or the double palatal bar. Now the disadvantage is that there is the palatal contact is very little, so the support derived from the bone, the support is derived from the bony palate, and as a rule the anteroposterior bar should not be considered as a first choice for maxillary major connector. It is also frequently uncomfortable. Now coming to the horseshoe or U-shaped connector, it consists of a thin band of metal running along the lingual surface of the posterior teeth and extending into the palatal tissue for 6 to 8 mm anteriorly, and the metal normally covers the cingulae of the teeth which are present and extend into the palate to cover the entire area of the rugae. The advantage is that this connector is primarily used when several anterior teeth are to be replaced, and it is a reasonably strong connector that can derive some vertical support and some indirect retention in the palate. Now the disadvantages are the vertical force is applied either on both ends of the horseshoe major connector. There is a tendency for the connector to spread out or straighten. That is, when the force is applied, there is a tendency for the metal to deflect. Now, therefore, there is a poor chance for distal extension partial denture. Because of this flexure of the major connector, it is not ideally suggested for a distal extension case. Now, for the same reason, it is not a good connector when cross-arch stabilization is intended, and it has less resistance to flexing, and the movement can occur at the open end. That is at the most probably at the posterior extent of the denture. Now coming to the closed horseshoe or anteroposterior palatal strap. Now structurally it is a strong and rigid major connector, and it may be used in most cases of the maxillary partial edentulousness, and it is particularly indicated when there is numerous tooth to be replaced, and when there is a palatal tori which you know is most frequently seen along the midline of the palate. Okay. Now the advantage of using a closed horseshoe is as it is a rigid connector, it derives good support from the palate, and even though the opening is even though there is an opening in between the palatal space, it provides much greater support from the palate. And the disadvantage is that even though the metal over the root may be thinner in some other major than in some other major connectors, the interference with phonetics may occur in addition to the excessive length of borders of the tongue in contact may cause annoyance or discomfort. That is, due to the coverage of the palatal coverage in the rugae area, some of the phonation must be can be interrupted due to the presence of a thick metallic plate at the rugae area. Now coming to the complete palate major connector. The complete palate major connector provides the ultimate in rigidity and support. That is, the entire palatal area is covered with a metallic component, and it provides the most soft tissue coverage, and also that gives the connector, so that gives the removable partial denture the most amount of support from the bone, and the connector can be made with any of the combinations. That is, it can be of all acrylic in nature. It can be a combination of acrylic and metallic components, and it can also be made completely out of cast metal. Now, the advantage of a complete coverage palatal major connector is when the posterior tooth are to be replaced bilaterally. That is, there is a edentulous in distal extension, edentulous on both of the sides of the arch. And it is also indicated when the anterior teeth require replacement along the bilateral distal extensions. That is, one or more anterior tooth might be lost along with the posterior distal extension bilateral. And coming to the distal disadvantages of a complete palate major connector, because of the extensive tissue coverage, there is a chance of adverse tissue reaction from the it might be due to allergy, it might be due to constant irritation from a metallic component. There can be a chance of inflammation or hyperplasia in the mucosa underlying the denture if the oral hygiene practices are not up to standards for the patient. And there can be a interference in phonation because of the coverage of the anterior part of the palate. Now we are moving on to the major connectors in the mandible. Now, the mandibular major connectors are of 4 types, that is the lingual bar, lingual plate, the double lingual bar or the Kennedy bar, or the labial bar. Now, coming to the labial bar, this is the most frequently used mandibular major connector. The advantage is that it is a very simple design, and the construction and the casting of lingual bar is the most easiest among the mandibular major connector designs. It is indicated for all tooth supported removable partial dentures unless there is insufficient space lingual to the remaining tooth. The lingual bar has minimum contact with the oral tissues, and it does not contact the teeth. So decalcification of the tooth surface might not be a concern, while it may be a concern where there is the cingulum coverage in a major connector in some kind of a major connector design. But in this case, there is no coverage of the cinguli, or the tooth surface is not at all contacted, so there is no chance of decalcification on the tooth surface, or it might not cause any induce any plaque accumulation or any other pathologies in the remaining natural tooth. Now, coming to the disadvantage is if care is not taken by the laboratory or the proper instructions are not given to the technician, then lingual bar may not be rigid. Actually, the lingual bar is a very cannot be made that wide, so it should be thin, and at that same time it should be rigid also. So the designing aspect of a lingual bar is of utmost importance. And this occurs when the attempts to use a lingual bar as a major connector when there is no enough space to place it correctly. That is, initially we mentioned there should be 3 mm gap between the gingiva and the major connector in a mandibular major connector. So if that criteria is unable to be met, then you should be considering other options as major connectors. Now coming to the next one, that is the lingual plate. The structure is basically that of a pear-shaped lingual bar with thin solid piece of metal extending upward from the superior border of the bar into the lingual surface of the tooth. Now the design is similar to the previous one, but the simple difference is that there is that metallic surfaces extends into the interdental area, covering the entire soft tissue, leaving the tooth part uncovered. Now it is indicated when most of the posterior tooth have been lost and it is to be restored, and the double lingual bar is indicated primarily when some degree of indirect retention is required, and the periodontal, and when periodontal treatment and its disease and its treatment have resulted in a large interproximal embrasures, and the upper bar should be positioned in the contact points of the teeth. Now the disadvantage is that the patients will feel more tongue annoyance with the okay okay now coming to the double lingual bar or the Kennedy bar. The advantages are that double lingual bar effectively extends the indirect retention in a anterior direction, provided it is supported by adequate rest at the each end, and it also contributes to horizontal stabilization of the processes because stress on the partial denture is distributed to all the teeth it contacts, and thus the total stress on each tooth is reduced. Therefore, it is indicated primarily when some degree of indirect retention is required when periodontal disease and its treatment have resulted in large interproximal embrasures. And this differs in lingual plate that it has no sheet of metal extending from below to the superior border of the palate, superior border of the plate into the to the pear-shaped lingual bar. And the disadvantage is that patient feels more tongue annoyance with double lingual bar than it is usually encountered with a lingual plate. That is, lingual plate is a continuous structure, but the Kennedy bar is different in such a way that there is a gap between the superior and the inferior component of the major connector, and this might cause an irritation when the patients to the tongue of the patient, because whenever the tongue moves, it interferes with the superior portion of the major connector. Now coming to the labial bar, the labial bar runs across the mucosa labial to the mandibular anterior teeth, or in some instances facial to the posterior teeth, and it also has a half pear shape similar to that of the lingual bar. Now the advantages are that when the lower anterior teeth and the premolars are so severely lingually inclined, a conventional lingual major connector cannot be used, and the labial bar can be considered. The disadvantage is that this results in the results of a labial bar are generally poor. The bulk of the connector distorts the lower lip and lip unless the lip is relatively immobile, and the mere presence of metal between the gingival tissue and the lip causes great discomfort to the patient. But this is a last option when there is severe tipping of the anterior tooth lingually, hindering with the plane of insertion and removal. Thank you. Have a nice